We move on now to the last theory in our list of SR learning theorists, and this is the theory called the drive reduction theory proposed by Clark Hull. Hull proposed a different form of SR learning theory. Overall, this theory gets less attention than it deserves. One might say that Clark Hull is an example of an unsung hero in the list of SR theorists, particularly when he is compared with stalwarts such as Ivan Pavlov and B.F. Skinner. Yet Hull's theory did make some contribution by inspiring some other theorists to extend some of Hull's ideas in areas such as conflict and personality. According to Charles Osgood, who in a sense has paid a kind of tribute to Clark Hull, Hull's theory stood on 4 pillars, namely evolutionary theory as proposed by Darwin, hedonism, which is the famous pleasure-pain principle, that is, human beings tend to go towards pleasure and tend to avoid pain. Associationism, basically connecting stimulus and response in explaining the process of learning, and Pavlov's theory of classical conditioning. Let us take a look at the basic ideas proposed by Clark Hull. First, learning takes place, like other behavior, on the basis of motivation, and the key motivational concept in Hull's theory was a drive or need. Secondly, a drive acts as a stimulus for behavior. It makes the organism or individual move towards a specific goal. The simplest example that can be given is, if one is hungry, the first idea that comes to one's mind is to try to get food, and therefore any response that is learned that takes the organism towards this goal called food would be considered a part of drive reduction or learning. Thirdly, attaining this specific goal results in the reduction of the drive intensity. In a sense then, drive reduction is reinforcing, and this is what explains learning. In other words, a stimulus-response connection is learned through a motivational process which involves the reduction of the intensity of a drive. In fact, Hull defined reinforcement primarily as drive reduction because he thought this was a sufficient explanation and conceptualization of the term. The whole process of learning, according to Hull, can be measured in terms of several components or variables. He strongly emphasized observability and measurability of responses and behavior. The assumption was, in Osgood's words, that the organism is a self-maintaining mechanism whose behavior is determined by a limited number of laws, and Hull believed strongly that these laws could in fact be identified through proper experiments. In Hull's theory, a number of constructs were proposed which were inferred on the basis of measurable processes. The constructs were neatly designated with the help of specific symbols. The constructs as well as the processes were explained also with the help of systematically laid out postulates, and there was in fact one postulate for each of the primary constructs. While allowing for some latent variables that might perhaps be considered remotely cognitive or mentalistic, in general, Hull did not encourage mentalistic or cognitive explanations for the process called learning. Here are some key concepts proposed in Hull's theory. Drive and drive strength. This was the major variable in the learning process. the response, that is the expression of what is learned, habit and habit strength. These illustrate the probability of making specific responses. Reinforcement, the reduction in the intensity of a drive. This works along with temporal contiguity as described by Hull. One might recall here that Hull was in fact intensely influenced by Pavlovian theory. Summation, this is the process through which successive reinforcements build up habit strength. Reaction potential, which refers to the tendency or capacity of the organism to respond. The method used by Hull is not in fact described anywhere in very great detail. He seemed to have used apparatus that enabled the study of rats running towards food or away from shock and similar experiments. Because he was influenced by Pavlov, it is quite likely that Hull would have used equipment that enabled him to study responses based on temporal contiguity as well. But one thing that is very clear about Hull's theory is the approach that he took, and that is described as the hypothetico-deductive approach. That is, a scientist should propose basic testable postulates, test them empirically, and infer processes from the findings. This is precisely how Hull tried to make his theory. What happened, however, was that Hull's postulate turned out to be rather complex and possibly too awkward to use as part of a learning theory. Many psychologists questioned his conceptualization of reinforcement as drive reduction in a sense that probably was very restrictive, and because there was this rival idea of reinforcement as consequence proposed in Skinner's theory, perhaps after some years, Clark-Hull's theory lost its shine and is rarely talked about in contemporary learning theory discussions. We embark on our journey now on cognitive theories. Two major theories can be described here. There might be some other cognitive theories that also play an important role in taking our understanding further about the learning process. A comment will be made about such theories. At the moment, though, the focus will be on these two theories, namely cognitive learning through cognitive maps proposed by Edward Tolman and cognitive learning through insight proposed by Wolfgang Kohler. The common element in cognitive theories of learning is the basic principle that what is learned is not a response, but something cognitive or cognitive associations. Let us take a look at the first of these theories, namely the theory of cognitive map learning or learning through cognitive maps proposed by Edward Tolman. Tolman is known as a neo-behaviorist or a cognitive behaviorist, in contrast to radical behaviorists like Skinner and to SR theorists. The basic principle in Tolman's theory was that learning takes place on the basis of cognitive associations. In other words, associations were not ruled out, but they were certainly not of the mechanistic kind between stimulus and response that had been proposed by the associationists. Tolman focused on the study of how rats and mice and also human beings learn correct paths. In the case of experimental animals such as rats and mice, it was a question of learning the correct path in a maze. Next, learning was described as being purposive, goal-directed, and it consists of acquiring what Tolman called meaningful behavior. A key concept in Tolman's theory is sign-significant learning, which can be abbreviated as SS learning, but this would not be a case of simple stimulus-stimulus learning, and certainly not a case of stimulus-response learning. Essentially, Tolman emphasized the fact that there is learning of and through cognitive maps. Given that they have to follow a particular route or a path, organisms will select the easiest and the shortest path to reach a goal. The fact that this path is the easiest and the shortest would be a case of learning. Another important point made in Tolman's theory was that reinforcement is not the main basis of cognitive map learning. It may, however, be needed for performance, but is not essential for learning. So, for example, we have first the case of a simple maze. You can see the rat starts at this point called the starting point and is expected to run straight to the food. Very often the place where the food is kept is called the goal box. We have another fairly simple maze, but with a certain other feature that adds to the complexity as far as rats are concerned. Observe this simple T maze. So, we have the starting point here, and the animal is expected to go straight upwards according to the orientation shown in the present diagram. But at this point, you will notice that the animal has what is called a choice point. Does it turn right or does it turn left? Now, before the rat actually learns the place where the food is kept, it would probably have an equal likelihood of turning left or turning right. In the illustration that is given here, the food has been placed on the left arm of the T maze, but it is entirely up to the experimenter to modify the place where the food is kept. We have now an example of what is called the multiple T maze, and as you can see, this is definitely more complex than the first simple maze that was shown and also the simple T maze that was presented. One can see this multiple T maze as being made up of several T's. We have the starting point here, so the animal is kept at this point and is then left to itself to run through the path as it thinks fit until it reaches the end, which is the place where food will become available. Here is another example of a complex maze, which is referred to as the radial arm maze. The animal is kept at this central point. What the animal has to learn is to go up each of these arms and find where the food has been placed. The rule is that the animal should visit every arm, such movements are allowed, only once. If the animal repeats its path, that would be classified as an error, at least at the initial stages of the experiment. Tolman also used a fancy complex maze which was very appropriately titled the sunburst maze. As you can see in the diagram, this indeed looks like a sunburst. You can see that this maze has several arms and it is slightly different from the rather simple radial arm maze that was just presented, which in any case would be at least slightly complex for an animal such as the rat. Like Hull's theory, Tolman's theory also consists of systematic propositions. The basic unit of behavior, according to Tolman, is what he called the behavior act. This involves holistic features of responses taken together and not single responses. Thus, Tolman proposed that one should take a molar rather than a molecular view of behavior. Secondly, learning involves what Tolman called means-end analysis, which means the learning of connections between means and ends. The end in this case would be the food wherever it is placed, which is treated as the goal, and the means would be any path, any set of responses or behavior acts, to use Tolman's term, that would enable the animal to reach this goal. Behavior acts indicate how means objects are linked to goal objects. Between the observable stimulus at one end of the process of learning and the learned behavior at the other end, which essentially represents the culmination of the learning process, intervening variables were discussed, and two specific intervening variables, namely demands and expectations, were highlighted as variables that guide the learning process. In Tolman's view, learning itself is cognitive in nature. In one sense, that means that this process called learning occurs even if it is not exhibited in behavior that can be observed from outside. For actual performance, however, something called behavior supports are required. Tolman, fond as he was of using fancy terminology, used these two terms that have made him famous: manipulanda, which referred to the manipulable aspects of the environment, and discriminanda, which refers to discriminable features of the environment. So, for example, in a maze, manipulanda would refer to those aspects of a maze that the rat could run through. One could see how the rat navigates its path, but beyond that, an animal such as the rat is probably not capable of changing much in the environment, except, for example, to climb over some of the walls that were presented in these mazes. Discriminanda, on the other hand, referred to those features of a maze that would enable the learner, the organism, to distinguish between, let us say, the correct path and the not correct path. So, for example, if a rat running through this maze encounters a blind alley, the rat would know that going through that path again is not going to enable it to get to the goal box. Four fundamental principles were mentioned in addition by Tolman as part of his theory. These principles were not exactly postulates, but they did help to bring out the basic propositions that Tolman had in mind. The first one is called the motivational principle. The second one, association principle. The third one is called the strengthening principle, which includes significant expectations and confirmation of these expectations. And the fourth principle is called the action principle. Let us look at these principles in turn. The motivational principle states that unless there is a motivational state or demand for a particular goal object, the action that is required will really not be initiated, and therefore the relevant behavior act will not be exhibited. According to the association principle, as the organism moves in the environment, it learns the relationships between specific stimuli, which were referred to as signs, and other stimuli that the former indicate, which were referred to as significates. That is, learning takes place in terms of significate associations. This was another phrase that was very specific to Tolman's own thinking and theory. The word sign itself is very meaningful because it refers not just to the stimulus characteristics of the learning situation, but also to the fact that every sign connotes or denotes another situation, and what it connotes or denotes is referred to as the significate. The relationship between these two contains another element called expectation, which will be commented on in just a moment from now. The third principle was called the strengthening principle, under which much was said about sign-significate associations. A very fundamental idea was that sign-significate associations are strengthened, made stronger, or weakened according to certain variables such as frequency, temporal contiguity, and so on. The second idea under the strengthening principle was that sign-significate expectations are strengthened through confirmation and weakened through disconfirmation. So, if there is a difference in strength of sign-significate expectations, one should not automatically assume that they would therefore have been confirmed or not confirmed, because this would be, in a sense, at least partly, a separate process. The fourth principle, called the action principle, said that the learned sign-significate relationships are expressed in observable behavior when the demand, that is the motivational state, is present, and also in a form that is appropriate according to the stimulus situation. To take a very simple example, if the rat that is placed in the maze is not sufficiently hungry, one should not be surprised to find that either the rat does not run at all, or if it does run through some of the alleys, it may stop at a point even though there is no food there. One should not therefore expect an animal or a learner to perform any response or behavior regardless of the motivational state. This idea by itself was probably not completely new, because it was encountered, at least in some form, in Skinner's theory and definitely in Hull's theory. All the four principles enunciated by Tolman contain the core idea of the theory. In addition to these four principles, Tolman also proposed some forms of learning that contain characteristics that differ in some respects from each other. The first form is what is called approach learning, a term that is fairly familiar to many psychologists. In general, approach learning refers to the learning that involves moving towards a goal. Escape learning, on the other hand, refers to moving away from an aversive or undesirable situation after it is encountered. The third form of learning, called avoidance learning, refers to moving away from an anticipated, aversive or undesirable situation. It is important to make a distinction between escape learning, which takes place after the aversive situation has been presented, and avoidance learning, which is like a precautionary move. A fourth form of learning, called choice point learning, is probably one of the highlights of Tolman's theory, as well as the forms of learning that he described. To take one other simple example, it is easy to see that the rat in a simple T maze would have to make a minimal choice or decision when it reaches the T junction. That is, it has to make up its mind whether it would turn left or turn right. But this is, of course, an example of a very simple choice. If one takes the example of more complex mazes, such as, for example, the multiple T maze, one can imagine that there would be several such choice points, and depending on how quickly, how rapidly the learner, the organism, tackles these choice points and makes a definite decision without faltering, it is that which will indicate to a fair extent how strongly the response or behavior, or to use Tolman's term, finally the cognitive map has been learned. Essentially then, choice point learning in Tolman's classification of the forms of learning refers to making a decision among more than one alternative form of behavior. And finally, the fifth form, once again, that made Tolman famous was the idea of latent learning. That is, learning that is not expressed in overt behavior and yet is actually present. Tolman addressed and answered two major debatable issues in learning. At the time in which Tolman was proposing his theory, these two issues particularly became suddenly very significant because those were the days when reinforcement theories were reigning supreme and Skinner's influence on learning theories, one can say even the whole of psychology, was unquestioned. The two main issues that Tolman took up rather boldly were, first, what is learned when we talk about a learning situation? Is it the learning of a response or is it the learning of cognition? What Tolman called the cognitive map, or precisely sign-significant relationships. The second issue was, is reinforcement necessary for learning? Now here one must keep in mind that reinforcement can mean consequence, as would have been defined by Skinner, or drive reduction as defined by Hull. One can also raise this question again, so what is learned? Is it a response or is it the cognition involved in the situation? The answer that Tolman preferred to give based on his experimentation and close observation was that it is actually cognition that is learned and not merely specific responses. Elaborating on this idea, he pointed out how it is the place where the food is kept rather than the response required to get to that food that the rat learns when running through the maze in terms of learning paths or specific routes. We see this even in human beings when, for example, we talk about wayfinding. If the person is even minimally familiar with the environment, making a required right turn or left turn comes quite easily to the individual, provided that he or she has already got a cognitive map of the situation. To illustrate his point of place rather than response learning, Tolman conducted specific maze experiments along with his collaborators. Now, if we take a look at the two diagrams shown on the screen, figure A and figure B, one notices that this rectangle shown here is the food box in this particular case, and the food box is in essentially the same place in figure B as well. But there is one important change in the two T mazes. In figure A, one can see that when the rat starts at the starting point, it has to go up to this junction and make a left turn. On the other hand, in figure B, if the rat starts at this starting point, it has to run up to this junction and make a right turn. If the rat has learnt the place where the food is kept in such a way that it can use a cognitive map of this T maze, then very clearly the findings that emerged from these experiments showed that place learning was definitely superior to response learning. This finding was basically reported by experiments conducted by Tolman and Honzik in 1930, and Tolman, Ritchie and Kalish in 1946. There were some other researchers who came up with similar findings. The idea was that one could train rats to run through these mazes in such a way that they would be reinforced for making specific responses. The question is it true that just because of these repeated reinforcements, for making specific responses, the rats would learn the cognitive map of the maze? The answer that Tolman and his collaborators found was no. This led to the next question: is reinforcement necessary for learning? Once again, as was mentioned, one should keep in mind that reinforcement can have more than one meaning. It can mean consequence, as Skinner postulated, that is, if the animal or the learner finds that there is a pleasant consequence because of a response that is made, the tendency to repeat the response increases. On the other hand, Hull preferred to define reinforcement as a reduction in the intensity of the drive. Regardless of how reinforcement is defined, according to Tolman, based on his experimental observations, reinforcement is not necessary for the process called learning. It may, however, be needed for what is called performance, and this came out in his definition of something called latent learning, meaning hidden learning, and along with this, the requirement for a distinction to be made between the process of learning and what is called performance. As we now understand it, Skinner and other SR theorists were actually looking at what we would call performance, but then that was because these theorists did not make any conceptual or operational distinction between learning on one hand and performance on the other. Tolman, however, found that this distinction is absolutely necessary because cognitive map learning is typically latent or hidden and can express itself in the required response as and when the situation arises. The absence, however, of performance should not be taken to mean absence of learning. The experiment, one can now call it a classic experiment, that was used to illustrate this point related to latent learning and the distinction between learning and performance was as follows. Different groups of rats were trained to run through the maze. One of these groups was given food on every trial, so this would be called the reinforced group. The other groups were given food only after a specific number of trials. That is, there was more than one non-reinforced group. What would happen in the non-reinforced groups is that the rats would be allowed to run through the maze so that the idea would be to make them familiar with the route that generally needs to be followed. However, it should be kept in mind that these rats, the non-reinforced rats, did not find food on the initial trials. What the experimenters wanted to see was, does the number of errors they commit while running through the maze reduce quickly, more rapidly than the reinforced group, or is it the other way around? Namely, is it the reinforced group that seems to learn faster by reducing the number of errors? The finding that came out was the reduction in errors in the non-reinforced groups was very fast, in spite of the fact that they did not get reinforcement on the initial trials. Now, this indicated that these rats, therefore, learned the path even without reinforcement. In other words, learning was going on, but it was latent because the learned responses were not necessarily shown in externally observed behavior. So, the nature of learning, as shown in this experiment and other maze learning experiments, was that it is cognitive in nature and goes much beyond the learning of mere responses. Along with this came the next consideration. Is there place learning or is it response learning? Once again, maze experiments were used to illustrate the point. Two groups of rats were compared. Group 1 was given food in the same location in a maze, but Getting to the food box required different responses, as was shown in the diagram just a few slides ago. For example, the kind of turns within the maze, right turn or left turn, and the number of right and left turns that were needed to arrive at the goal would differ. Group 2 was given food at different locations in the maze, but this required the same response patterns. That is, every time the rat would turn left, there would be food waiting, or every time the rat learned right, there would be food waiting. In other words, the idea would be that rats in group 2 would be forced, in a sense, to learn not the route, but to make specific responses. The finding of this maze experiment was that group 1 learned better than group 2. This was something Tolman always was anticipating, because he refused to accept the idea that learning basically consists of single separate responses that can be treated as units of the learning process. What was the impact of Tolman's theory? The first point that needs to be made is that this theory was generally accepted, although he had ideas that went against the then current notion of reinforcement being the strongest basis of learning. Minimally, Tolman's ideas drew attention to the possibility of learning based on connections, but non-SR forms of connections. The second aspect of Tolman's theory was that he questioned the role of reinforcement as the major basis of learning. There are many students and researchers who marvel at Tolman's courage, because it would have been a rather difficult task for him to take on as eminent a psychologist as Skinner, along with his collaborators. Clark Hull's theory was also one that was reigning at that time. The idea, however, was that Tolman did not want to study learning as a process based on something that does not give us the complete picture or the correct picture. One should not, however, get the impression that everything was fine with Tolman's theory. In fact, his theory has also been criticized on some grounds. For example, many of the ideas that he proposed were not very clear. One small example is this idea of demand proposed by Tolman. Is a demand the same as a drive? In which case, perhaps the term drive should be used. Next, can the theory be extended to other kinds of learning? This once again was a limitation that was pointed out, and many believe even now that this probably is a kind of limitation, but it does not go against the basic theory that Tolman proposed. The situation or the setting that Tolman used for proposing his theory seemed to be restricted to spatial learning, although there are psychologists and others who try to extend symbolically the idea of cognitive map to settings other than spatial ones. We now move on to the second form of cognitive learning, which goes by the name learning by insight. One will see very clearly that the features of this second cognitive theory were quite different from those of any of the theories that have been talked about so far. However, some features are similar, but one will have to look at them carefully. Wolfgang Köhler, a noted Gestalt psychologist, proposed this theory that goes by the name learning by insight. The basic principle of this theory is that learning is a holistic process that takes place on the basis of a process called insight and is not stimulus-response associations or any other kind of associations. What is learned is principles or concepts rather than specific responses. However, it is also true that these principles and concepts, once learned, would enable the learner or organism to make whatever responses would be required in specific settings. Over trials in a particular learning situation, there is a sudden or abrupt decrease in errors and not a gradual decrease in errors. One may recall that in trial and error learning, the decrease or decline in errors is by definition gradual. Consider a problem-solving situation. The learning process may begin with random attempts on the part of the learner to solve the problem. Of course, the person may not be getting closer to the solution at all and is actually only making attempts that probably would help the learner to move closer to a solution. In other words, it might resemble groping in the dark, at least with respect to some learners. So initially, in such a problem-solving situation, a large number of errors would be committed over trials, and this may go on for several trials. But all of a sudden, the organism hits upon the solution and attempts it. If the solution is found to be correct, this is the phase that is called insight, and this is what is shown in terms of a sudden decrease in errors. One can see this phenomenon in the diagram that is shown on the screen. One can see that initially there would be a large number of errors, and all of a sudden at a particular trial or particular point in time, the number of errors comes down virtually to zero, and this is the point at which the task has been learned, the problem has been solved, or to use Köhler's term itself, the person has got insight. Köhler's experiments with a chimpanzee, in fact more than one chimpanzee, are by now very well known. He also studied the process in children, but his experiments with chimpanzees are probably much more famous. Particularly the experiments conducted with one of his chimpanzees, who was named Sultan, has received a lot of attention. The basic situation that Köhler experimented with was as follows. A chimpanzee was placed in a cage with food outside, let's say bananas. The bananas were clearly out of reach of the chimpanzee, but were of course very visible to the animal, and what the animal had to learn was that they could be pulled into the cage with the help of a stick. Obviously, this idea was not very difficult for the chimpanzee to appreciate. So this animal was provided with a single stick which was not long enough to pull the food in. The stick could be used to pull in another stick, and the second one could be used to finally pull in the food. There is also a modification that has been talked about, because Köhler conducted several experiments, not just with chimpanzees but with some other animals as well. But coming back to the chimpanzee experiment, one variation was that Sultan would be given two sticks. One could be fitted into the other one because they were hollow bamboo sticks. But the question was, would the animal learn this principle? What was found was something that was described in great detail, but the distinctive feature was the phase of insight is accompanied by what Köhler called an aha experience. One can see that there is pleasure as well as surprise, and also the sense of accomplishment, very much like what Archimedes must have gone through when he cried out "Eureka" when he found the solution to the difficult problem that he was assigned by the king. Often, insight learning is followed by trying to generalize or apply the learned concept to other situations. Another feature of insight learning is understanding of the situation as a whole rather than its specific parts. Even if there is apparent learning of parts, the learning process is complete only when all the parts are organized or integrated into one whole. Osgood has specifically pointed out characteristics of insight. The first one is what is called suddenness. We have already seen that in our discussion. The second one is smoothness, which implies that the transition from making many errors into making no errors at all comes suddenly, but then the process remains smooth without any jerks or starts. In other words, once the solution has been found, there would not typically be cases where the same high number of errors would be repeated. The third characteristic is occurrence of the solution to the problem. In other words, the learner feels that the problem has been solved and indeed there is a solution. And finally, novelty of the solution has been mentioned. This means that the solution was not really obvious or evident to the individual and probably had not been discovered by many others in the same situation. Particularly when people talk about creative or productive thinking, novelty of the solution or innovativeness is a characteristic that is emphasized. In real life, we do encounter numerous instances of insight-based learning. So, the applicability of this theory is high, especially in the case of human beings. Further, this theory explains learning in academic contexts that involve learning of concepts and not response learning. One does not have to go very far to see that this is very true. So, if one takes the example of a child learning, let us say, to solve an algebra equation, it would be too much to suggest that such learning can actually take place simply through stimulus-response association learning. Rather, unless the child learns the basic concept or principles involved in solving such algebraic equations, there really would be no learning at all. Several psychologists interpret how intelligence as a factor plays a role in problem solving in a way that is very similar to what has been described in insight learning. Now, this per se should not be surprising because, as in the case of problem solving in which insight is expressed, so in the case of many items or puzzles that are given for ability testing, such insight or suddenness is almost expected, and it does indeed serve to show the ability level of individuals. Summarizing the stimulus response theories and the two major forms of cognitive learning that we have just described, the following features can be said to be common or dissimilar between various theories. First, problem solving or puzzle solving element. This is actually the idea of whether the situation requires or involves correct and incorrect responses. One can see that this problem solving or puzzle solving element is present in trial and error, cognitive map, and insight learning. It is not highlighted in Guthrie's contiguity learning. Such an element is not part of classical and operant conditioning, or for that matter of Hull's drive reduction theory. Second, there is response learning in Guthrie's contiguity learning, trial and error learning, classical and operant conditioning, and Hull's drive reduction learning. But in cognitive map and insight learning, there is cognition learning, and this has been highlighted sufficiently. Although all learning is expressed ultimately through responses or through some observable behavior, one should be very clear about the fact that the main process in cognition learning is not response learning. A third point that has to be noted is that associations are the basis of learning in Guthrie's contiguity learning, trial and error learning, classical and operant conditioning, Hull's drive reduction learning as well as cognitive map learning. But this feature, namely associations, is not part of insight learning. One should, however, be careful to point out the dissimilarity in the nature of association in some cases. So, the association in classical conditioning and cognitive map learning is described as SS or stimulus-stimulus association, whereas Guthrie's theory, trial and error learning, operant conditioning and Hull's theory involve SR or stimulus response associations. However, there are differences that have to be kept in mind. Both classical conditioning, which is a form of response learning, and cognitive map learning, which is a form of cognitive learning, are based on SS associations. In classical conditioning, the SS association was initially said to be neurophysiological in nature, according to Pavlov, and not psychological or cognitive. Later psychologists such as Rescorla and Wagner introduced a cognitive element. However, in cognitive map learning, the SS association is stimulus-stimulus of course, but also what Tolman called sign-significant association. This phrase implies that this association contains a cognitive element of expectation, on the basis of which cognitive maps are learned. It would not be too much of an error to point out that expectation in fact is supposed to be part also of the SS association that is talked about in the context of classical conditioning, and yet what is expected is fundamentally very different between classical conditioning and cognitive map learning. The next point that has to be mentioned here is the presence of reinforcement or its equivalent. Now, this is a requirement in trial and error learning, operant and classical conditioning, and Hull's theory. But it is not a requirement in cognitive map learning and insight learning. Guthrie did not consider reinforcement essential for the learning process. One must remember that Tolman took a lot of trouble to point out how reinforcement may be needed only for performance or the expression of what is learned, but not for the basic learning process. Further, in classical conditioning, the term reinforcement occurs or comes into the picture in the sense of strengthening of the response, but this is brought about not in terms of any consequence or in terms of a reduction in the intensity of a drive, but rather by confirmation of the expectation, something similar to what is found in cognitive map learning, but with regard to cognition. That is, in the typical classical conditioning paradigm, reinforcement would be of a cognitive kind to the extent that following the CS, the UCS appears as expected. In the case of cognitive map learning, on the other hand, every component of the learning situation may act as a sign for the rest of the situation or for the next component that is coming up, and both together, the sign as well as the significate, are connected in such a way that the whole cognitive map is learned. What reinforcement actually means according to different theories also needs to be understood. According to Skinner, as was pointed out, reinforcement is that consequence of a response that increases the probability of that response. Punishment, on the other hand, in Skinner's theory, is that consequence that decreases response probability. For Hull, the meaning of reinforcement was quite different. It was that which reduces drive intensity. Therefore, when a comment is made indicating that reinforcement may or may not be part of a particular learning theory, one should also be careful about defining what reinforcement means according to a particular theory. In classical conditioning, we have a special case. Reinforcement, as was pointed out a while back, contains a cognitive element. So, an expectation can also be reinforced or strengthened by confirmation. For Tolman, although confirmation of sign significant expectations strengthens cognitive map learning, this is not considered reinforcement. Here is a kind of distinction that has to be made very subtly. Instrumentality of the response is yet another feature that perhaps should also be commented on. It would be noticed that this feature is present in one form or the other in most SR and cognitive kinds of learning, except in classical conditioning. However, instrumentality is not the main basis of learning in most forms of learning. It receives prominence in trial and error learning and operant conditioning. Its role in Guthrie's theory is hazy, although the kind of learning situation taken up by Guthrie seems to involve instrumentality. So, what one has to keep in mind is that the mere presence of something that appears to be instrumental in nature does not define that kind of learning as being based on instrumentality. For example, if we take the case of insight learning, it is difficult to imagine anyone learning to solve a problem without this element called instrumentality. However, as such, this feature does not qualify insight learning to be called an instrumental form of learning. Generalization as a sub-process is a part of all learning theories. The process of generalization, however, varies, and also the extent to which this can take place in particular forms of learning. The scope for generalization is greater in insight learning compared to the other forms of learning, including cognitive map learning. Now, why should this be the case? Probably the answer is that because insight learning involves concept learning or the learning of principles, the applicability or extension of these principles has a far wider scope compared to the kind of responses that are learned in specific situations, such as classical or operant conditioning, or trial and error learning, or Guthrie's contiguity learning, or Hull's reinforcement drive reduction based learning. What about cognitive map learning? There could be more than one view about this, but there are several critics who point out that because cognitive map learning has been proposed in a spatial context, perhaps it would be safe to say that generalization of cognitive map learning, if at all possible, would be extended or would be taken only to those circumstances where the cognitive map has a resemblance to the situation in which the original learning took place. Guthrie's contiguity learning and trial and error learning appear to generalize only to contexts that require the same kind of response, and very often these responses are mechanical or limited to very specific skills. Extinction is another feature that can be found in more than one form of learning. Again, the probability of extinction is greater in SR forms of learning than in cognitive forms. However, the basis and the nature of extinction in each form of learning would be different. Is that an exception in the case of insight learning? The question that we are raising is, can concepts learned through insight ever become extinct? One notices that in classroom teaching, very often depending on how much the concepts taught in a particular course are going to be used by the students, determines how long the students will actually retain what has been learned. But then we must have more sound ways of finding out whether concepts and principles that have been learned are ever forgotten or ever extinct in the sense in which this term has been used by learning theorists. Having completed our list of SR theories and of cognitive theories in general, we now turn attention to the third group of theories that are called social learning theories. There could be more than 3 social learning theories that have been listed here, but what is common to all of them, as is evident from the term itself, is that a social element is built into these theories with quite a lot of consideration and intention. Of course, these theories, like the ones we have seen so far, are also based on extensive research and analysis. We will be talking about 3 theories that fall under this category. The first one is once again called social learning theory, proposed by Julian Rotter. Social cognitive theory, proposed by Albert Bandura. Social developmental theory, proposed by Lev Vygotsky. The third one might perhaps appear to be an odd one, because most textbooks in psychology and most courses taught in psychology departments that deal with learning theories do not say very much about Vygotsky's theory. It is only more recently that Vygotsky has been getting attention, and there is every reason for us to include at least a minimal discussion of this theory because of the contributions that it has made. We will begin with social learning theories as proposed by Julian B. Rotter. The basic concept in this theory is that the process of learning takes place in the context of a social environment and social variables. What is learned becomes part of an individual's behavior and also his or her personality. Thus, there is continual interaction between the individual on one hand and his or her environment on the other. The environment, of course, could be a physical one, but Rotter was interested in looking at the influence of the social component of this environment. Besides, the environment changes, and accordingly, the individual's behavior also changes. One may, however, see that individuals acquire some characteristic ways of behaving with regard to specific stimuli, and characteristic beliefs may emerge out of the individual environment interaction after a duration of time. For instance, by the time an individual grows up to be an adult, one may find that specific beliefs have been formed in the individual that make it an identifiable part of that person's personality. Rotter was influenced by Skinner's view of behavior, as is quite evident, and to some extent also by Hull's view. He subscribed to many and most, one could say, of Skinner's concepts, but only to the extent that they applied to personality and only those that show a social context effect. The core variables and concepts in Rotter's theory were as follows. Reinforcement value. This refers to the extent to which specific outcomes are valued. Individuals want these outcomes to happen and want many other outcomes not to happen. This, of course, fits in with what is otherwise known as the hedonistic principle. People in general, human beings in general, would like pleasant outcomes and would like to move towards them, to engage in behavior that enables them to get pleasant outcomes, and would likewise be interested in avoiding all those outcomes that are unpleasant, uncomfortable, or aversive. But the degree to which different outcomes are valued is what is emphasized in the concept called reinforcement value. A second core concept in Rotter's theory is expectancy, once again a term that is frequently used not just in learning theory, but in many other contexts. This refers to the subjective probability of an individual that indicates the likelihood that a particular behavior will lead to a particular outcome. In other words, an individual may have his or her own view or belief that a particular action or behavior is likely to lead to a particular outcome. This outcome could be positive or negative. A third concept that deserves mention here is behavior potential. This is the likelihood that an individual will show a specific behavior in response to a specific situation. Given that individuals in any situation are likely to exhibit many behaviors, behavior potential varies for different behaviors. This was illustrated or summed up in this very simple equation that contains the basic idea behind studying something called behavior potential, and that is that behavior potential is the function of expectancy and reinforcement value. In a sense, this small formula resembles the kind of formula that Skinner was famous for, except that the function variables here are expectancy and reinforcement value, which according to Rotter could be measured. Another element in Rotter's theory that needs mention here is past history of reinforcements. If one looks at what Skinner was studying, one could see that in the case of animals such as rats or pigeons, one can only look at something like history of reinforcement by considering what Skinner and his associates called schedules of reinforcement. But in real life, and particularly with human beings, as life progresses, it is difficult to imagine that an individual would take every experience and every day as being independent of past experience. And that is what results in the cumulative effect of past history of reinforcements, which in Rotter's view was a very important determinant of his or her personality. Speaking of the past history of reinforcements, what Rotter said was that behavior is the result of learning, and this learning takes place on the basis of past history of reinforcements. One should keep in mind that these reinforcements could be for positive behavior or desirable behavior or otherwise. Among other things, more importantly, an individual's reinforcement history leads to the development of a belief based on generalized expectancies, and it is these generalized expectancies that are expressed in the form of what Rotter called locus of control. This variable could be internal or external.